Hi, the following content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. If you are a healthcare provider, please consult with your affiliated institution or local ethics committee for ethical guidance related to clinical practice.
This is Module 6. Take it away, David.
Okay, so up until now, we've been primarily talking about theories of action and approaches to making decisions about what to do under different circumstances when you're trying to make decisions at the level of action. But there are another set of ethical theories around the issue of distributive justice and what to do about what would constitute a legitimate and just approach to distribution of goods, and including benefits and risks. May recall that for principalism or common morality theory, justice was the fourth principle, but we didn't really go into it in very much detail, and that's because unlike the other principles, there are actually different theories of justice, which is acknowledged in your reading and discussed in your reading. There are three primary approaches to justice. Those are utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is not just a theory of right and wrong action. In fact, in some ways, its main influence may be as a theory of distributive justice. There's egalitarianism, and there's something sometimes called prioritarianism. So let me start by saying a few things about justice and distributive justice. The first is just a reminder of something we talked about earlier, which is that Aristotle's formal principle of justice, which is that if you're going to treat people differently or they're going to have different access to goods, it better be that the reason why they're getting differences in access to those goods is based on something that's a morally relevant characteristic. And remember, we talked about the example that access to grades should be based on something morally relevant like class attendance or quality of work, and not in something irrelevant like money or hair color or height, which would be inappropriate ways of distributing goods. Another thing to think about when it comes to thinking about different competing approaches and distributions are recognizing that you have to distinguish between the a just process and a just outcome or distribution. So there's sometimes a distinction between procedural justice and actual justice in the distributions. So this reflects the fact that even when you do things the way you should do them appropriately, it may be that because of circumstances outside of somebody's control, the outcomes may wind up being unjust in the distribution as a function of things like broader racial issues in society or other unequal distributions in society that wind up producing those effects. In a couple of weeks, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, you're going to see some examples of how this works itself out. So I just wanted to talk about that. When you're thinking about procedural justice, the intuition there is that a just outcome is a function of a fair process. So, for example, if there's enough chocolate cake for two people, for me and
Sorry.
No problem. If there's enough
fair processes lead to just outcomes.
Right. So if there's enough chocolate cake for roughly two people, and my wife and I are both going to have chocolate cake, a fair process would be one person cuts the cake and the other person gets to choose first which piece they want. So that
an age-old algorithm for distributive justice.
That's it. The age-old algorithm for distributive justice for two things. And we'll come back to that in a minute when we talk about prioritarianism. So utilitarianism says when you're trying to figure out what a just allocation system is, it's pretty simple. When you're trying to figure out, how to divide up the pie, make the pie as big as you can. Whatever the biggest size pie is, that's the one you want, even if it's extremely unequal in its distribution. So even if you're cutting this up so that some people have really huge slices and some people have incredibly tiny, thin little tiny sauce slices. That's okay as long as the pie is as big as possible. That's utilitarianism. In contrast, egalitarianism,
Wait
which
a
is
minute, just to make sure, that's a big pie. A small pie where everybody gets an equal amount is not as good because it's about total goodness in the world. And the utilitarian will, so this is a pie of goodness.
right. That's exactly right. So if you think about whatever the goods are, let's say they're quality adjusted life years, whatever way of distributing things to maximize quality adjusted life years, that would be what you would want to do if that's the good you're trying to maximize. In contrast, egalitarianism would say you want to make sure everybody gets the exact same size of slice of pie, even if that turns out to produce a smaller pie. And we have different intuitions about each of those things. Uh, Equity and treating everybody the same is a very, very powerful intuition that people have, and it's often the starting point for allocation of resources. When it comes to allocating seats on the bus or on BART, we use an egalitarian framework: first come, first served. Whoever shows up first gets to go on and gets to sit down. That would be an egalitarian way of distributing those goods. We might have a little bit of prioritarianism, which I'll talk about in a minute, but for the most part, that's what we do. We don't, for example, say, gosh, if we allocated seats so that in order of people who are more tired than others, we would have a much better use of the seats and get more utiles out of that and more overall good from doing it that way. That's not what we do, and we often start that way. More seriously, if you think about how we usually start with allocation of organs, almost every distribution scheme for the allocation of organs started from an egalitarian one of first come, first served. And then they
This is for
slowly
transplant. This is the allocation of organs for transplant. We're not just going to allocate your organs without your permission.
Yes, no, this is the allocation of cadaveric organs for transplant. So after people die and they procure their organs, they have a system for allocation, and those are distributed. Usually, those distribution schemes started with an egalitarian framework of first come, first served, which is reflected in wait times, and then they usually move from that to systems that get you more bang for the buck, because those are very, very disutile ways of doing things. And so there's a move to make them more utilitarian. But interestingly, they don't go all the way to be completely utilitarian. Instead, they often opt for a third approach, which is sometimes called prioritarianism. And prioritarianism, I'll talk about the work of Rawls in a minute, and this reflects something that he calls the difference principle. But for prioritarianism, what you want to do is, instead of maximizing the total amount or trying to give everybody an equal amount, prioritarianism says you can only justify divergence from egalitarianism if it benefits those who are the worst off. So that's the idea of prioritarianism. Sometimes it's called maximin. You want to maximize whatever the worst bottom share is. If it turns out...
Am I spelling this right? Maximin? Is that what we're...
Maximin, yes. It's not a real word, so yeah, that's fine. Perfect. So you want to maximize the minimum share. The idea, and you're going to draw another circle now.
Okay, yeah, I don't know what this circle is going to look like.
So let's suppose that by allowing some level of equality, we could actually have a pretty big circle, maybe not quite as big as the utilitarian circle, but a pretty big circle.
Okay,
but
so we have a pretty good, this is a pretty big pie of good.
Right, pretty big pie of good. But it's distributed unequally. But okay. The biggest, the smallest piece of this pie is, if you look at the volume of the smallest piece of this pie, it turns out to be bigger than all of the equal slices of the much smaller pie. Then that's what allows you to diverge from giving everybody an equal share.
So tell me if I got this right, egalitarian pie. So the smallest piece, shown here in nicely filled in black, is bigger than the slice size in the egalitarian pie above. when you add
Correct.
it up. Like, let me just fill it in over there. Just
And
so,
it's also bigger than the smallest piece in the utilitarian scheme.
okay.
So the
Also,
idea is
oh,
so the first one says make the pie as big as possible. The second one says make all the pieces the same size. Prioritarianism says make the smallest piece the biggest it can be.
well, let me ask you one technical question. Is it bigger than the smallest piece for that person in the utilitarian pie, or
Yes.
for any of the pieces in the utilitarian pie?
Well, so the pieces would represent individuals in the pie.
Right, right.
Or populations. If you don't like individuals, then it's either people or sets of populations. So you want to make the sets of the populations. Your goal is to make the smallest piece as big as possible. You want to maximize the
Right.
size of the minimal piece. So maxim
Okay.
in,
Right, right,
maximize the minimal share.
right.
Another way of thinking about it is there are different versions of prioritarianism. A consequentialist version of prioritarianism says we're still sorry, we're still weighing consequences. Sorry, not maximum. We're looking at the consequences of the different frameworks, but all we're really doing is just putting our thumb on the people who are at the bottom. So when we're weighing it out, utilitarianism, remember we said for utilitarians everybody counts equally. Well, that's not true for prioritarianism. They put their thumb on the scale of, and if you're at the bottom, you count more. If you're at the bottom, whoever's at the bottom, we're going to count you more in prioritarianism.
So somebody might argue that this is a departure from a justice principle.
No, this is a different theory of justice.
Okay.
It says we owe more to the
Ah,
people who are at the bottom, and that a just distribution reflects thinking about the people who are at the bottom. And this is very much reflected in our organ transplant systems. We definitely don't have, we've moved away from most organs, away from first come, first serve, which is where we started, because it's just so wasteful. But we don't have a perfectly utilitarian scheme either. Instead, we think about things like the rule of rescue. The people who need it the most, people who are at the bottom and who need the organ the most, we give them the higher priority. So when it comes to giving livers, we don't give it to the person who's most likely to live the longest. That's not who gets the liver and liver transplantation. Instead, we give it to the person who's the sickest and needs it the most, because they're at the bottom of the scale, and if we don't give it to them, they're going to die. And so we save those people, even though we would probably get a little bit more bang for our buck if we actually distributed things to give them to people with lower MELD scores, which is the way we evaluate how sick you are and how soon you're going to die if you don't get an organ.
that's MELD.
MELD. It's a way of scoring how bad your liver failure is.
Great.
So those are the three different theories of justice, and obviously, if you or main theories of justice, I'll throw in a fourth that really isn't playing as big a role because it's actually much more straightforward. But people may have heard of libertarianism.
I think
And
a lot of people have heard of that.
And it's actually not really a straightforward theory of distributive justice. Most people who have heard of libertarianism or say they're libertarians don't know what it really means. Libertarianism is just the view that there are no such thing as positive rights. That's all libertarianism is. They recognize that there are negative rights, but they don't believe that there are any such thing as positive rights. And if there are no positive rights, that means the state can't do anything there has no obligations whatsoever to benefit people, except insofar as it's a collaborative thing in everybody's interest. So people can come together through the state to say, we'll all pitch in to have roads or to engage in defense. But you couldn't say that that people have a right to an education and therefore people should pay taxes to help ensure that everybody's entitled to an education or everybody's entitled to health care. So libertarianism is just the view that there's no such thing as positive rights. It has a lot of very unintuitive consequences to it. It means, literally speaking, if you're walking along the pier and there's a child drowning and there's a life preserver and all you got to do is kick it to save the child's life, libertarians would say that it's a good thing for you to do and it would be nice of you to do, and as a matter of personal morality, maybe you should do it, but it would be wrong for the state to think that what you did was negligent or harm or something that the state could take action against you in any way. It also means in practice giving up on any kind of notion of equality of opportunity. Now, I wanted to say a couple of things about the derivation of prioritarianism. Prioritarianism was derived from by the theory of justice that's probably most associated with thinking about justice in the last 100 years, is the work of John Rawls, and a book that he wrote, a famous book he wrote called A Theory of Justice. And Rawls sort of put a lot of these pieces together by saying, in the same way that a just outcome is a function of a fair process, whoever cuts the cake first, the other person gets to choose. If you're trying to think of how to allocate resources for society, a fair process would be for people to be placed behind a veil of ignorance in which they know general things, but they don't know who they are. Because if you're trying to figure out how to allocate goods in society and what would be a good and fair allocation scheme, people are going to tend to benefit themselves. And I'll just give an example, which we may talk about in class. When you look at allocation schemes that have been proposed by different physician ethicists, they've almost always said that in cases of tiebreakers, physicians and clinicians should go first. And often they give some rationale for that related
This
to
has
other
been
things.
used in the COVID epidemic in terms of access to healthcare resources for the people who have.
Correct. People have argued, and one very prominent model approach says physicians should get the tiebreaker. Now, their reasoning is physicians are themselves a scarce resource, and we need them. And if they need a ventilator to be able to be physicians, then it's worth doing. Except for the reality that if a physician is sick enough to be put on a ventilator, they are not going to be able to deal with the epidemic, and they are not, in fact, going to be beneficial. So that's been criticized by other ethicists and highlights that, look, if you have a group of people who get to decide who's at the top of the heap, it's not surprising that people will tend to put themselves at the top of the heap. So Rawls' solution to that is to imagine a situation where you don't know who you are. So you don't know if you're going to be rich or poor. You don't know if you're going to be really smart and highly educated or really dumb. You don't know if you're going to be extremely religious or a hardcore atheist. You don't know anything about, you don't know your sex, your gender, your race. You don't know anything about yourself. If you don't know any facts about yourself, how would you arrange society? And he says you would arrange society in accord with two things. First, you would want equality of opportunity. And I'm just talking here about the distribution of goods. He would say, first, you would want equality of opportunity to be able to pursue goods, which carries a lot of implications when you're thinking about healthcare. And then second, you would opt for a prioritarianism or maximin, because for all you know, you're going to be at the bottom of the heap, and so you'd want to be the best off. So that's really where that prioritarianism, I think, has been given a lot of weight, is from Rawls. So these different approaches, utilitarianism, prioritarianism because of Rawls, egalitarianism, all of these different competing theories play a role. In practice, what happens is that each of these different theories wind up giving rise to more specific principles, which then wind up playing themselves out. In particular, thinking about things like equity, so egalitarianism turns into the principle of equity. The theory of utilitarianism turns into either utility or efficiency. Different people have called it different things. And prioritarianism has turned into the rule of rescue, helping the people who are in greatest need. And those three principles play themselves out and are balanced as people try and think through what the right way of thinking about appropriate resource allocation is. And so in class, we'll ask you to think about this and to think through how to allocate some resources that reflect the kind of decisions that we're actually making in real life at the hospital.
So just one quick question, David.
Yep.
When I think back at the common morality principles, I can see that equity is going to be related to, not the same as, but related to issues of justice, obviously. Efficiency is related to utilitarianism. Is there an idea of rescue in the common morality?
Well, all of these different approaches to justice, distributive justice, even utilitarianism, all fall under that principle of justice.
Okay.
And in fact, it says this in the readings that there are multiple ways of cashing out what it means. To each an equal share, to each according to their means, to each according to need. These are all different ways of thinking about what justice really means. And these are really the more theoretically worked out frameworks for thinking through distributive justice.
Does this end the module?
It ends the module.
Thanks very much. We'll see you at the next module.